Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, thank you for joining us for the newest episode of Inflection Point Podcast. This is the spot where we are dedicated to the art of listening in authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of self-awareness and understanding, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, it's Mavis Bauman.
Hi, it's Gail Hunter, and welcome.
So the 2024 theme is community conversations. And in this episode, we take a deep dive into the art of community conversation in today's climate of EDI, anti-racism, and book banning. So we're just going to jump right into the conversation and just really start thinking about exactly what is community conversation, what does it look like, and why is it so important? So I'm going to start off with an article written by a gentleman by the name of Michael Ratner. And the article appeared in the Cosmos Journal for Global Transformation. And the title of the article is How to Have a Community Conversation, Setting the Stage for Engagement. And so when you think about the idea of having a community conversation, it is directly linked, directly connected to engagement. Right. And so when you think just in general of having a conversation, if you're not engaged in a conversation, the conversation falls flat. Somebody ends up not really knowing or understanding what the other person was talking about. Everybody's kind of looking at it through their own lens. That is not what community conversation is about. So in Michael Ratner's paper, he actually has a quote. And I'm going to read this quote because it really gives the essence of what a community conversation actually is. And this is the quote: "A community conversation is a form of group dialogue that often addresses issues of local or larger concern. Participation is usually open to all and may lead to some form of action, consensus, or objective by the participants. Regardless of the size of the gathering, when individuals assemble to engage," and again, there's this idea of setting the stage for engagement, assemble to engage in dialogue related to self-determination, it often becomes a community unto itself. Community conversation is a collective process that has the potential to transform individual thought into collective consciousness. And this comes from a gentleman by the name of Yankovic, and this was from an article that was written in 1991. So the idea behind community conversations is bringing the right people to the table. So if you've been listening to us, you hear us talk a lot about coming to the table, sitting down at the anti-racism activation table. And that's really what this is about. That table represents that space for conversation. So it's bringing the right people to the table, and that means bringing everybody. That means diverse perspectives, right? That means diverse experiences. That means different lived experiences, different historical experiences, and all of that. So it's about being open and being inclusive and having those right people at the table but it also means being strategic about how do you go about reaching out to individuals to even participate in the community conversation in the first place. And so we're talking beyond like just doing email. You want to also consider residents who might not have access to technology, or what are some of the community spaces that might be available for these gatherings, if you will, to happen. So the idea is really being strategic and being very conscious of who you're drawing into the conversation, who you're drawing into the space. Where is that space located? And is that space located in an area that is easily accessible for the people that you want to participate? So as I'm talking, you can hear that there's a lot that goes into having a community conversation, particularly if you are going to do that, you absolutely want it to be successful. So it doesn't make sense to kind of do it halfway, or to come in with maybe this not taken care of, or we're not sure we're going to have it. You want to just kind of have all of this stage set before individuals actually come into the space. And the meetings need to be easy and fun to attend, right? So this is about engaging. I'll keep referring back to this word of engagement. It's about engaging people. It's about building that trust, gaining those connections, building those connections among those community members. It's about having icebreakers, because if you have this diverse group, you want to have some different ways of breaking the ice so that that conversation can begin to emerge in a very fruitful kind of way. And then one of the key pieces of having a community conversation is the ability to listen intentionally for the purpose of understanding and perspective taking. And what I mean by that is taking yourself off the table and entering into a dialogue with another person who has a very different lived experience than you, a different historical experience than you, and being able to step into their perspective. And for me, stepping into someone else's perspective is a little bit more than kind of just stepping into their shoes, right? You've heard that old saying, step into someone else's shoes and kind of just kind of get that experience. But what I'm talking about is really stepping into someone else's shoes and walking around in those shoes, and walking around to be able to see, what do they see as they walk in those shoes? What do they feel? What do they experience as they're walking in those shoes? And this is also an area where I do a lot of work with the Center for Creative Leadership as an on-call facilitator. And one of the things that one of the programs that they have is around how do you have better conversations every day? So if you think about how that idea might feed directly into community conversations, and they have a really nice model that kind of lays out how do you sit in that space. And it's called the LACE model, LACE. And LACE stands for listen for facts, feelings, and values. And this is intentional listening. This is listening for the purpose of understanding and taking someone else's perspective. So listening for those facts, feelings, and values, right? But then it's also asking questions, but asking supportive questions and asking challenging questions to deepen your understanding of where that individual might be coming from, and asking those why questions. Well, if this or if that, but it's designed again to make sure that you are receiving whatever that individual is talking about, whatever it is they're communicating, that you are receiving that into your own self-awareness and your own understanding. And so the E actually stands for establish next steps and clarify what can be controlled, influenced, and or accepted. So if you think about, again, community conversation, you go into the community, you go into the conversation, you want something to come out of it. And so one of those things that come out, well, we've had this initial meeting, as an example, What are our next steps going to be? How do we continue the conversation? And how do we go about clarifying what are those things within the context of that conversation can we control or can we influence? Or are there things that are acceptable and not acceptable? But the idea is that it's the entire group that is engaging in this type of conversation. And then there's just a few more things I want to mention, and then I want to open it up and get some comments from Gail and Mavis. It's using small group discussion to create room for more conversation. So as you begin to have these community conversations, it creates the space for even more conversation. And I don't mean more just in terms of the quantity. I'm also talking about the depth of those conversations, right? And it's about sharing thoughts and being comfortable, having people present to kind of capture some of the notes so that when you're moving from one community conversation into another, you have a record that says this is what we talk about in the previous session. These are some of the next steps that we established, that you always have this record of what is going on in that conversation. And again, it's about asking questions. It's also leaning on democracy, identifying those priorities and those challenges and those dreams and those aspirations and all of that, and being able to share that openly in a very democratic type of way. Then it's also embracing the little wins. Now, we want to dream big and all of that, but we also want to honor those small wins along the way. So when you have a bigger goal that you're trying to achieve, you also want to make sure that you're hitting those milestone goals along the way, and sharing those new ideas and being innovative and all of that. And then obviously there's the follow-up. So every time there's a community conversation, there has to be a process in place for there to be follow-up. And then that follow-up becomes the starting point for taking action. And I wanted to lay all of this out also because Gail and I are considering doing some community conversations within the context of the work that we do through the Place to Soar as well as through OMA. And so we want to make sure that we know how to do it, and that we know how to do it well, and that we know how to do it effectively. So at this point, I'll just kind of open it up. Your thoughts, ideas, comments on some of the things that I just talked about?
You want to go, Gail? I see you about ready.
Yeah, it's crucial to be able to learn how to listen effectively and communicate in a way that is respectful and honors self and other, right? And whomever it is that you're talking with, let alone in the conversations that you're talking about, Anita, in the community, especially over the topics that we're working on. So those listening skills are really crucial, and they're hard. I'm sure everybody has had the experience of listening to somebody and you're more focused on what your thoughts are in your own mind than what that person's actually saying to you. And so what you're talking about is reversing that and saying, no, you want to focus more on what the person's saying, and allow curiosity to come and be interested and curious authentically to find out more and more at a deeper level, because that's how we really can connect to another and what allows us to understand and to begin to create change. It's crucial. Yeah,
Absolutely. Mavis?
I just learned a word in the context of doing this podcast, and that is decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
Decentralize yourself.
yeah.
And I just think that is like a basic tenet of having a good conversation. I think it's natural to want to kind of inch our way into the center of the conversation and say the most exciting or enlightening thing. But if you decentralize yourself, you really do enable yourself to listen. So I think that's a fabulous concept. The other thing is, these conversation rules are, it can apply to a community of two, really, right? Whether it's even intra-family or within a team at work, or a whole city, that wants to come together on a particular point. So I think it's really good to think about these tenets in that way. This isn't just for whatever you think of as a community. This is about opening up yourself to learning and to engaging with others in a productive way.
Absolutely. And you drive home a really, really good point. Because when you think of the word community, the community starts in your home.
Right.
Your family, that's a community. And then each one of those individuals in that family goes outside of that home and they engage in that local community. That might be your neighborhood, your friends down the street, right? But then each one of those also goes into a workspace, or that might be going into a school, or they might be going into a church. So everywhere that you go, practically, you're in a space of community. Yes. And so to your point, these conversations, being able to engage in these types of conversations from these perspectives that we're talking about are so critical. And I think given where we are now, because just think about it, we're having more conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, racism than I have ever experienced in my little Black life of being on the planet. All of this
in my little white life.
Exactly.
And
exactly. And so much of it is centered around engaging in conversation.
Yeah. And it's a win-win mode. It's not a win-lose debate sort of situation. But because when you were mentioning the idea of success, success to me would mean any sort of concept that you learn that sort of softens your attitude on something, that tells you something that you didn't know you were operating on, though, anyway. That's a success. It's not who wins the conversation.
No. Absolutely.
That's the way I would define it. Yeah. Okay.
It's about raising your own consciousness and about raising another's consciousness, right? And that's what we're here for. We have to risk a vulnerability in listening and also in expressing and sharing. But it's so valuable and so worth it and so much needed.
So worth it. Exactly.
Absolutely. So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mavis, and she's going to lead us into the second part of this idea of these community conversations. And she's going to focus on a book called The Conversation, written by Robert Livingston. And he specifically developed a press model. And Mavis is going to walk us through some background information on the book itself, but then how this press model rather, relates directly to how do you engage in community conversations.
Great. Thanks, Anita. I hope I can do his book justice, because it's just a lovely book, so readable. Livingston's life work is about showing people how to turn difficult conversations about race into productive instances of real change. And most of what I've consumed in the book thus far is about organizational change. And he has this press model, and I'm going to go into it in more detail as I go forward. But PRESS is an acronym. The P stands for problem, really identifying the problem through detailed analysis. Somebody might identify the problem one way, someone another way. So you have to come to consensus on what the problem is. The next letter, R, it stands for root cause. What is the root cause of that problem? And then third, empathy. He makes a good distinction between sympathy and empathy, which I'll describe later. And strategy. Are you willing to take action to solve the problem, and how will you do that? And then the last S is for sacrifice, which I think is a scary word to most people, because we aren't really collectively understanding what we mean by sacrifice. Sacrifice does not mean that you have to lose something. You may have to change something, but you will also gain. I'm going to just pull out a couple of things that I loved that Dr. Livingston said in his book. He says, often organizations have called him in because they are in crisis and suffering. They just want a quick fix to stop the pain. But enduring long-term solutions usually require more than just a pill for the pain. So he talks about first building consensus, and understanding the problem and where it comes from. And if feedback is rising through various communication channels, showing that whites feel that they are the real victims of discrimination, then diversity initiatives will be perceived as the problem, not the solution. So we might be thinking of discrimination in the workplace as anti-Black, but the conversations that he's had over some period of time and research is that whites are feeling that they are more discriminated against, which I think is really interesting. Things are just changing, but that whites are more discriminated against does not bear out statistically, of course. So we'll talk about problem awareness here for a second. We know that racism continues to oppress people of color. Whites, this is cool. Whites in the United States believe that systemic anti-Black racism has steadily decreased over the past 50 years, and that systemic anti-white racism has steadily increased over the same time frame. Just parenthetically, white racism is an implausibility in the US. We just got to, that's just not a thing, okay? There's not, I'm just going to leave it at that for the moment. But this belief is important because they can undermine an organization's efforts to address racism by weakening support for diversity policies. I was talking with a relative about racism, and he said, well, that's over. Since the Civil Rights Act of 1965, that's over. And I had no idea. I mean, it depends on what world you live in, but if you're in a pretty white world, you're not dealing with this. Mm-hmm. But we need to, of course, lift this veil and see that racial discrimination is prevalent in the workplace, and that organizations with strong commitments to diversity are no less likely to discriminate. I think that's fascinating too. Just because you say you have a commitment to tone down or, get rid of discrimination doesn't mean you aren't already discriminating. Racism is not defined just by deliberate actions motivated by malice and hatred. Racism can occur without conscious awareness or intent. Now, that's something we have to hold on to. It's like Gail was referring to earlier, just being, increasing consciousness about it. The research estimated that just being white conferred the same benefit as an additional 8 years of work experience to a Black person, a dramatic head start over equally qualified Black candidates. So this is the idea that connects with whitening a resume, changing your name from Lakeisha or something to, Laura, just so that your resume can start going through the process. This can be done, unconsciously by whites as they're reviewing the resumes. They may not even know they're doing that. Livingston says there's a very small sample of many studies that have confirmed the prevalence of racism in the workplace, all of which underscore the fact that people's beliefs and biases must be recognized and addressed as the first step. Now, we've talked about beliefs and biases till the cows come home, as we say in Nebraska. But if you believe that as a white person, you are being discriminated against, you've got some work to do. Those beliefs cause us to dig in our heels and hang on to a certain strategy or way of approaching teams, everything. So we need to really examine, as you say, Anita, what our beliefs are and what we're operating on the inside, cultivating the inside of ourselves. Mm-hmm. So second, the root cause analysis is critical to choosing the best remedy. Most racism is the result of structural factors. And that means like established laws, institutional practices, and cultural norms. When we think, well, at least I'll say for myself, when I think of racism, I think of individuals, and I think of bad individuals or bad characteristics of individuals. This people is so structural, and it's just in every system we live in this country. he says again, many of these causes do not involve malicious intent. Nevertheless, managers often misattribute workplace discrimination to the character of individual actors.
Mm-hmm.
So that's rather than to the broader structural factors. So it's easier to say, look, Joe, you're the bad apple, you got to go. But the issue is really structural. His attitude may be supported by the systems right within the company. So as a result, managers tend to roll out trainings to fix employees while dedicating relatively little attention to what may be a toxic organizational culture. I just thought that was really interesting, and I've experienced it and never been able to label it. Appealing to circumstances under one's or beyond one's control is another way to exonerate a deeply embedded cultural or institutional practices that are responsible for racial disparities. He gives an example about how this area that wanted some degreed people in marine and environmental science to come to work on a job at Chesapeake Bay, and they couldn't find anybody. And the deal is they weren't casting for particular people at, let's say, historically Black colleges and different areas to pull up those, diverse candidates. I had another conversation with a relative who said, look, no one Black has applied to my law firm. Well, why is that? Why is that? There are reasons that that is not happening and that you're not getting a diverse organization. Another thing is blaming an inadequate pipeline, which is kind of what I was just describing. There were no Black applicants coming through. He uses this analogy. I see we don't have a lot of time, but this analogy really hits home. He uses the idea of a fish in a stream analogy. The current in the river is analogous to systemic racism. If you do nothing, just float, the current will carry you along with it, whether or not you're aware of it. If you actively discriminate by swimming with the current, you will be propelled faster. In both cases, the current take you in the same direction. But from this perspective, racism has less to do with what's in your heart or mind and more to do with what's in your actions. So then workplace discrimination involves, like a salmon, having to swim upstream against the forces of the structure. So I'm going to kind of whip through the rest of it. The third term is empathy, and that has to do with the level of concern about the problem and the people it affects. And you need to ask yourself the question, do you care enough? And I think that's so key, because in most of the lives I've been exposed to in my own life, I didn't have to care enough. I was insulated from it. And he writes, there's a difference. I had alluded to this earlier. There's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Many white people experience sympathy or pity when they witness racism, but it's empathy and experiencing the same hurt is what we're really going for. Then I'll move on to strategies for addressing the problem. Most actionable strategies for change involve three distinct but interconnected categories: personal attitudes, informal cultural norms, and formal institutional policies. And you have to address racism at all of these levels. And if you don't, one is likely to cause the other to fail. And last but not least, sacrifice. That has to do with the willingness to invest time, energy, and resources that are necessary for the strategy implementation. A strategy is no good without implementation. We can talk, again, till the cows come home. We have to go for implementation. Sorry, I went a minute long Do you want to go for a break then, Anita, or?
Yeah, that's okay. Just very quickly, Mavis, thank you so much. That was a really, really thorough overview of what it is we're talking about here and how it all relates to this idea of being engaged in these community conversations, particularly when we talk about racism. And you really pointed out some good things, made some good points, I should say, in terms of the white perspective. And if you don't have that ability to decentralize your whiteness, you'll never be able to fully understand what does racism feel like for me when I am in this corporate environment or I'm in some other type of space where that racism is very real for me, but you can't feel it, you can't see it. So often I'd like to, just have a conversation with someone who feels like a white person. Tell me, what did that discrimination feel like to you?
Yes. Yes.
What did that actually feel like? Did it help you? Did it impact your character? Did it impact how you see yourself? Did it make you feel hurt? Did it make you feel angry? What did it make you feel on the inside that can compare to the reality of racism as it exists? So we're going to take a break at this point, and then we'll come back and we're going to go into our third segment. And Gail is going to talk to us about community conversations in relation to book banning, which basically relates back to racism anyway. So there you have it. So we'll take a break and we'll be right back. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast and our community conversations for 2024. Our topic in this episode is the art of community conversations in today's climate of equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and book banning. So we're going to turn the mic over to Gail, and she's going to talk to us about community conversations as it relates directly to book banning.
All right. So the AAHA, which is the African American Heritage Association, held one of the few in-person community conversations since the series began more than 3 years ago. The community members joined at St. Pete's Tombola Books on August 16th to discuss the recent book bans in Florida school districts, which I'm sure many of you have already been reading about or hearing about. Basically, Nikki Hill, who's an educator, said that books are the tools that we use to be able to make sense of the world, and adding that the children will only be deprived in profound literature with ongoing book bans. It angers her that certain books are being placed on a sort of blacklist in educational settings around the state. Between July and December in 2022, Florida State Schools districts banned over 350 books, according to the nonprofit organization PEN America. Some of the titles that they banned were Naya's Long Walk, A Step at a Time. Was for a young adult novel, Nowhere Girls by Amy E. Reed, and a classic like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Will Baldwin, a member of the AAHA, grew up in a white suburb of St. Pete and admits that he was never taught the African American community's contributions regarding the city's founding and building. He likens books being pulled off shelves to the whitewashing and cherry picking of historical facts, the same skewed history that he received in his household growing up. Jake Ann Jones, co-author of Sometimes Farm Girls Become Revolutionaries, calling the ban of books a kind of denial and erasure. And he says, I see book banning as an act of cowardice, noting that it has gone on throughout history in places like Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and Pinochet's Chile. People don't have the bravery to confront the ideas that challenge theirs. And it seems to me that the antithesis of education is it's not the furthering knowledge, it's trying to destroy knowledge. There's also at this conversation Dr. Charles Dew, who's a retired professor and author of The Making of a Racist. And he said, this isn't the first time there's been a movement to ban information in this country, pointing out that beginning in the 1830s, the subject of slavery in debates was off limits for 30 years. It ultimately led to the bloodiest conflict in our history, which was the Civil War. To close off debate, to close off consideration of ideas is very dangerous, he states. We only have to look at our own history to see this. Carl Lavenue, another person that was there at this conversation, community conversation, is the chief equity officer at the Foundation for a Healthy St. Pete. And he said that politics are behind any recent statutes to pull books from shelves and behind the way Black history is being taught these days. As the new Florida curriculum maintains, that slavery could be viewed, and I remember reading this in the paper, as beneficial to the enslaved because they learned trades and developed skills. If there was anything that we would call gaslighting, that was gaslighting. The truth is that the slaves were kidnapped from their countries because of the skills they already had and brought to this country to farm the plantations in order for the slave owner to make a lot of money off of them. So Dr. Du agrees that he thinks Florida is a case study for this because the governor there wanted the Republican nomination for president and figured this was the most direct path to get there. I also think, he says, into the fear of some whites who feel dispossessed, that if they're not getting ahead, it's because somebody else is responsible. And they're always that other that has to be blamed, instead of taking ownership, obviously, of what is one's to own. Will Baldwin, who's an educator, feels it's laziness and fear of not wanting to confront personal shortcomings and the issue of race in this country. He believes it's difficult to come face to face with racism in your own family, maybe your own personal behaviors. And it's easier to just ignore it, to claim that you're colorblind, and it's easy to ban things rather than to be a parent and just monitor what comes through that door. There's a bit of shame in thinking that perhaps historically you were on the wrong side of things, and that is not something that is comfortable to think about, says Nikki Hill. She is also at this conversation. She also feels it's about power. If white children learn the atrocities committed against Black people while learning the contributions and gains Black people attain while enduring systemic racism, white supremacy would weaken, is what her belief is. Shame is a factor in seeking to whitewash history or remove the books from the shelves. Lanisa Emanuel of the Alabama Institute for Social Justice notes that shame is a factor in seeking to whitewash history and to remove the books from these shelves. And she says that the governor of Alabama has even asked educators in the state to remove a resource book for developmentally appropriate practice, which informs them of techniques used to create welcoming environments for children of color and LGBTQIA+ and young people. That's pretty incredible. The very thing that everybody might be able to benefit from. And so it's just a level that she believes is of almost evil, that's so emblematic of what has always been at the root of racism. This desire to keep people ill-informed or not educated because they understand that there's power in knowledge. And that's been an issue throughout racism in this country. Lavender knows that there are solidarity movements pushing back against the book bans. Dr. Du says that more white voices would be crucial to any solidarity movement alongside African Americans in railing against bans and whitewashing of history. And I hope everybody hears that statement because I think that's so true. We have got to build a multiracial democracy in this country. And the only way we're going to do it is if white people step up and say, we're not going to take this stuff anymore. Hill agrees and stated that stating education will have to come from us. And it must be a community effort of white and Black people to ensure that children learn the facts of history, however uncomfortable they may be. Book banning campaigns have changed the lives and education of librarians also. And they now need to learn how to plan for safety and legally protect themselves. Librarians are the experts in classification, pedagogy, data science, social media, disinformation, health sciences, music, art, media, literacy, and yes, they do tell stories. They are storytellers. And right now, librarians are taking on an old role. They're defending the rights of readers and writers in the battles raging across the United States over censorship, book challenges, and book bans. A book challenge is an attempt to remove a title from circulation. A ban on a book means the actual removal of a book from a library shelf. And the current state of bans and challenges is the most notable and intense since the McCarthy era, when censorship campaigns during that Cold War period of political repression included public book burnings. These battles aren't new. Book banning can be traced back to 1637 in the United States when the Puritan banned a book by Massachusetts Bay colonist William Pynchon, they said was heretical. As long as there have been book challenges, there have been those who defend intellectual freedom and the right to read freely. Librarians and library workers have long been crucial players in the defense of books and ideas. And at the 2023 Annual American Library Association Conference, scholar Ibram X. Kendi praised library professionals and reminded them that if you're fighting book bans, if you're fighting against censorship, then you are a freedom fighter. Library professionals maintain that books are what education scholar Rudine Sims Bishop called the mirrors or the windows and sliding glass doors that allows readers to learn about themselves and others and gain empathy for those who are different from them, which is what we've been talking about for the first parts of this podcast, how crucial that is to learn how to look within yourself, to develop that empathy so that we can all grow and change. The drive to challenge, ban, or censor books hasn't only changed the lives of librarians across the nation, it's changing the way librarians are now educated to enter their professions even. As a library school educator, you hear the anecdotes and questions and concerns from library workers who are on the front lines of the current fight and are not sure how to react or respond. But once there still is a curriculum that includes book selection, program planning, and serving diverse communities in the classroom, is now expanding to include discussions and resources on how students, once they become professional librarians, can physically, legally, and financially protect themselves and their organizations. And if you're not aware that that's what's happening, there are many that have already had their lives or their families threatened. The degree librarians are professionals with master's degrees from nationally accredited academic programs. And many who work on college and university campuses have actually master's and doctorates. K through 12 librarians have to have a valid teaching license or state endorsement to work in school, library, or media center, and they know how to select appropriate materials for their communities. Librarians adhere to core values and standard professional ethics, and they see their duty to create and maintain a collection that reflects the diverse needs and interests of the entire community. And they've been doing this for decades and decades and decades. The Freedom to Read statement of the American Library Association says, it is the responsibility of publishers and librarians as guardians of the people's freedom to read, to contest encroachments upon that freedom by individuals or groups seeking to impose their own standards or tastes upon the community at large, and by the government whenever it seeks to reduce or deny public access to public information. So there are books that are challenged and banned for many reasons, including from profanity, depictions of sex, LGBTQIA plus content, depictions of sexual abuse, equity, diversity, and inclusion content, depictions of drug use and alcoholism, anti-police rhetoric, and providing sex education. Reasons for challenges can be personally subjective, and claims that books present divisive topics that could be excluded from collections are increasing. George Johnson is an author and frequently of the banned book, All Boys Aren't Blue. And he has said that he believes books are challenged to eliminate narratives that elucidate the truths of marginalized groups and depict the everyday diversity of their lives. Johnson believes the stories of the LGBTQIA plus and the minoritized communities are specifically under attack. His complaint in a recently filed federal lawsuit against Florida's Escambia County School District and School Board, which unanimously voted to remove Johnson's book from their school libraries because of the passages that described a sexual experience. Traditionally, debates of what books are appropriate for school libraries have taken place between a concerned parent and a librarian or administrator, and resulted in a single title or a few books being reevaluated and either removed or returned to the shelves. But unfortunately, recently, the issue has been supercharged by a rapidly growing and increasingly influential constellation of conservative groups. The organizations frequently describe themselves as defending parental rights. Some are new and others are long-standing, but with a recent focus on books. Some work at the district and state level, others have national reach. And over the past 2 years or so, they have grown vastly more organized, interconnected, well-funded, and very effective. The groups have pursued their goal by becoming heavily involved in local and state politics, where Republican efforts have largely outmatched liberal organizations in many states for years. And they've created political action in committees, funding campaigns, endorsing candidates and packed school boards. And they've helped to fuel a surge in challenges to these individual books. And I know I am out of town, so I'm going to stop there. But I think this is a huge issue that's going on, and one that we all have to start to really take seriously and look at.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Gail, for that very, very informative piece. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of go back to. We don't have a lot of time, but just a couple of things I wanted to go back to. And one of the things, Mavis, that you said earlier when you're talking to, I believe you said was one of your relatives, and the statement was, well, we had the civil rights movement, right? We had the Civil Rights Act and all of that.
Yeah.
But that's why when you listen to our introduction, one of the things that we say in the introduction, that we are looking beyond just laws and legislation, because laws and legislation can be changed. So it looked like one thing in the 60s, but it looks like something very different today. The erosion of the Civil Rights Act, the erosion of affirmative action, the erosion of Roe v. Wade, all of these things. So just because something is written in as a law in a certain period of time, doesn't make it right, number one, and doesn't mean that it can't be changed. We change laws all the time, right? And when you relate that, the idea of changing laws, and you relate it back to politicians, you relate it back to white supremacy. That's part of the issue, is this power thing that's there that is wrapped up in the laws and legislation in this country, right? And then something else that was said about the slave trade. And I believe it was DeSantis making the statement that, the slave learned skills. No, they came with skills. They came with skills.
That's why they came.
Exactly. That's why certain slaves who raised up certain crops, such as rice, were selected to be able to come to the Americas and produce that rice here. They came with skills, right?
The slave traders sought out the people.
They were kidnapped specifically.
That is exactly my point.
Yeah.
That is exactly the point that I'm making. And again, all of this nonsense, if you will, about book banning. So it's one thing if you want to protect your child, a young child, against books that talk about sex, for example. But why did you ban Ruby Bridges, the book that talks about Ruby Bridges?
Right.
Why would you ban that book? Why would you ban some aspects of works with Dr. King, right? And so you're taking a very swooping approach that if this one small segment of the population, white parents, disagree with something, then they have the power to impact everybody else. And that is the place where we are right now.
I just want to interject some irony that it is the extreme conservative white parents, white families who are shouting for freedom that are restricting books. I mean, through our whole lives, right? If you want to read a book, you read it. If you don't, and it's like content you don't agree with or just don't want to know, you can avoid it. I just don't understand what they, other than way back to, again, white supremacy, loss of power, loss of the power through people knowing history.
And I think one of the things that happens when you think about the issue of book banning, or just a whole conversation about racism that people may be having in their homes, it's one thing for you to be teaching your 3-year-old something, but what happens when you have a middle schooler who has Black friends, and your middle schooler is now coming home and challenging your ideas because you're looking at that Black friend through one lens, and they're looking at that Black friend through a different lens. So now you've got conflict in your home, because not all children, not all teens, not all young people are buying into where their parents are coming from, right? And one of the examples, Gail, I believe you mentioned that, or if you did not, was the group of white kids. This is a group of young white kids that are forming these book banning clubs where they are literally coming together to read the books that were banned.
Right.
right? And so now
That's
you're
cool.
creating, you're setting
Right.
yourself up to create this conflict in your home because your children are now going to go out and have a different experience than you. So now how do you rationalize that, or how do you reconcile that?
I love that kids would take that approach.
Yeah, that's
And,
great.
you know,
And their whole developmental stage is to separate and individuate and find out where they begin and end. And that's one way the parents are setting them up to be able to do that, right? To give them an opportunity to go and rebel against that and to want to read. And it's for a good cause. It's their rights to freedom, to be able to read what they want.
in other words, what the parents don't want them to read is what they want to read.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Right,
we're winning
exactly.
again.
Right.
Exactly. Like, didn't you learn that when you were a teen?
Yeah, right.
Of course. Right.
And so we are literally just about out of time. So I just wanted to offer up some final thoughts and a call to action, particularly a call to action. We would like to share more and more of these messages that we're sending out. So I'm encouraging people who are listening to our show and you're getting something out of it, be sure to share with those people in your network, because we're looking to get our message out there to a much broader audience. So those of you who are listening to us or have been listening to us for quite a while, we're counting on you to go out there and spread these messages throughout your own network. We also have a private Facebook group, and it's called Inflection Point Podcast, and it's about engaging in the conversation. So we're inviting people who see these videos, who hear this podcast, to come into that space as well, because that is our community conversation space. And so, Mavis, Gail, any final words? I just wanted to call those things out before we close out, but your final one thought?
One thought. I think my thought is decentralize yourself and see what you can learn.
You'd be amazed at what you can learn by just listening and really effectively listening.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to close out with this quote. And this is a Robert Livingston quote. We divide ourselves into us and them based on all sorts of random and insignificant traits. According to the optimal distinctiveness theory, humans are drawn to social groups that simultaneously fulfill two conflicting needs: a need for assimilation or the desire for social connection and affiliation. So I want to thank you for listening and joining us on this episode of Inflection Point Podcast right here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday, 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. And we welcome you into our next show, and be sure to spread the word about Inflection Point Podcast. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.